Well, hello and welcome to another Monday night Q&A. I'm joined tonight by my colleague Craig Hawkins from the field assessment team. Evening, Craig. How's your Monday been so far?
Evening, Sam. Very well, thank you. It's been nice and bright on the southeast coast, so it's been a good day.
Yeah, a bit of sunshine does us all good, I think. And hopefully most of the country got it today. As with all our Monday night live Q&A sessions, I'll just run through a few house rules. We'll start off tonight with we'll start off with the question of the week, which we posted out across social media channels earlier today, and then we'll go through the answer to that. And then while you're putting your questions in the chat, we'll go through some of the questions we didn't get around to from previous Q&A sessions. So please, while you're thinking of them, put your questions in the chat, remembering that there's no such thing as a stupid question, only stupid answers. Please remember to be respectful to each other in the chat, as that, you know, the whole idea of this evening is that collectively we'll help each other out with our main aim of improving our collective knowledge and understanding of all things associated with BS 7671 and the world of electrical installations. So let's just remind people, if they haven't seen it, of the question of the week. So the question of the week this week was, do electrical installations of residential park homes fall within the special location section 708 for caravan and camping parks? And we gave you three possible options. Yes, they do fall within section 708, or no, they don't fall within section 708, or we did give you the option of a third choice, a maybe. Perhaps there's some specific reasons which determine whether they do or don't. So in a nutshell, do residential park homes fall within that special location section 708, Craig? What's your initial thoughts on that?
So the best thing to do with this is go to 708.1 and look at the scope of which that special location covers. And it talks about it's the particular requirement contained in this section apply only to circuits intended to supply leisure accommodation vehicles, tents or residential park homes in caravan parks, camping parks and similar locations. However, there is a note that sits below that, note number 3, and it says the electrical installations of residential park homes are covered by the general requirements of 7671, together with the relevant parts of other sections in Part 7. So what this essentially tells us is that in a park home, it is a no. However, if that caravan is in a caravan park where there is leisure accommodation, then it would do. But generally for the caravan park, so the residential park home, it won't. So no, it wouldn't do.
Yeah.
It's to do.
Sorry. Go on.
It's to do with the perceived risk and danger that is presented to a caravan park 708 at least, in relation to the removal and the reconnection of the supply to the caravans that could be moved, manoeuvred and reconnected on a semi or regular basis.
Yeah, so that's the big key, isn't it? It's different levels of risk. So we're not talking about touring caravans, like you say, that will be frequently moved, that will be regularly connected and disconnected, and while they're moved, the installation within those touring caravans is obviously suspect to vibration and quite harsh use and wear. We're looking then at the residential park homes, the purpose built. And in fact, if I just show the audience, there is a definition in part 2 of residential park homes. So these are these factory built, produced for relocatable dwellings. So although they can be moved, the idea is that they'll be built and basically put in place and then used. So they're designed for permanent residence, which may be used for leisure purposes. You might hire them out, for example, but in general these are the ones that are going to be in locations for a long time. Another very sort of generic example would be that they wouldn't be plug and socket, whereas our touring caravan would be a plug and socket connection for its supply to a hookup point. And when we're talking about the residential park homes, we'd typically be talking about generally a fixed wire connection, a supply coming into a typical domestic consumer unit, and it would be hardwired in. It would be what's deemed a permanent connection as opposed to a socket and a plug and socket connection. So no, they don't come in, and as you rightly said, scope makes it nice and clear. 708 it applies to circuits intended to supply those leisure accommodation vehicles, and not for the vehicles themselves. If we're talking about touring caravans, that's covered in section 721, and if we're talking about residential park homes, as the note says, that they're covered in general regs because they're seen as a factory built item. Okay, we'll take a few other questions that we've got while we're waiting for our audience to post some into the chat. So another common question that we see, do I need to provide RCD protection for a 16 amp 3-phase socket outlet? So is 3-phase, does that come into play when we're looking at whether it needs RCD protection or not, Craig?
No, regulation 411.3.3 doesn't differentiate between single phase and 3-phase, or even the type of socket outlet for that matter, being a Kamado type or a 3-pin domestic plug, for lack of a better term. So the provision of that regulation in general terms means that we do have to have RCD protection on that. It does say in that section that in AC systems, additional protection by means of an RCD with a rated operating current not exceeding 30 milliamps shall be provided for socket outlets for rated currents not exceeding 32 amps, and there's some criteria for these. So it would be where there's going to be used outside, and there is an exception to this, and the exception is a documented risk assessment, but that's only for installations not in dwellings. Okay, so in dwellings, then we would have to provide RCD protection for socket outlets up to 32 amp. Non-dwellings, then there is the option to have a risk assessment where we may omit the use of RCD protection for that socket outlet. Under the 18th edition amendment, original and amendment 1, there are some changes to amendment 2 which we may or may not go into here. I'll probably spend far too much time on it, I'd imagine, for this Monday night Q&A, but there is some changes in amendment 2 in relation to that. But as it currently sits, it's the risk assessment is for non-dwellings. Yeah,
and I've just flashed up the that regulation for tonight's audience, and it talks about the exception. But the key thing is it's the threshold of whether we need RCD protection or not. It is associated with the current rating of the socket outlet and not the voltage. So it's irrelevant whether it's single phase 230 volts or 3-phase 400 volts. It's really the current threshold that determines whether or not the additional protection of an RCD is required. So yeah, but a common one, people kind of think that, oh, it's not required, is it, for 3-phase industrial sites? Well, it is required. However, in those locations, i.e. non-domestic, you have got that option of a risk assessment. Okay, another one that's been in the pot from before, and again a common question that we get on the helpline is, can BS3036 rewirable fuses still be used? So Craig?
Yeah, there's no reason why a 336 can't be used. It's still referenced in BS 7671. It's still in table 41.2 for the maximum permitted ZS values. Okay, and it's also in there in relation to 432.4 for overcurrent protection for 3036s for their time current characteristics. There's nothing precludes it in 7671 to use it, although it's not something we would probably see many people install, but it can still be used. There are some guidance in the best practice guide number 4 in relation to condition reports in relation to when you see 3036 fuses, and it talks about there's nothing wrong with them as long as there's providing adequate circuit protection and overcurrent protection and fault protection for that particular circuit. What we do have to consider is that when we're using those particular devices, there is a factor of 0.725 and associated with overload protection, and it's to do with the curve, the overcurrent time current characteristic curve, and how it slopes in relation to the amount of current needed to operate it within a time, and it's more liable to sustain overload currents for long periods of time than most of our other protective devices.
Yeah, spot on. You know, they're referenced in lots of places as an acceptable overcurrent protective device within 7671. And it's a good point to pick up on Best Practice Guide, because there is a bit of a myth buster at the back of Best Practice Guide 4, which this one falls in, because a lot of people think straight away, oh, BS 3036, that's an old type installation, therefore we must record it as an observation. But it doesn't need to be. You know, if providing you've got adequate protection that's required. Obviously you can't use a 3036 fuse for additional protection, so if it requires that, it'd have to be a secondary protective device as well. But yeah, bottom line is we can still use 3036s as an overcurrent protective device. Another goodie, can I use a single conductor to bond both gas and water services? So in an installation where perhaps those two different water services are coming in roughly the same location, can I take a single conductor out there to provide a bonding conductor to both services?
Yeah, there's no reason why you can't use the one conductor for both services, as long as that conductor is continuous, and making sure that in the event that there is any work being done on one of the services, that it then isn't disconnected and not servicing the appropriate bonding requirement for the second service that may have been left in service. We also have to make sure there's appropriate warning labels and durable safety electrical connection do not remove permanently fixed at those locations as well, to warn people that, you know, we shouldn't be removing them unless they're being removed from service for a particular reason and they're required to be removed. But no, they can have a single conductor that provides both services. We see it in many installations where it's linked across from one service to another, because they come into close proximity to one another. It saves cable, it saves cost, and it saves having to provide two conductors that essentially do the same thing.
Yeah, absolutely, perfectly acceptable. And as you say, because there's a reg in the section about proximity to other services that talks about we have to ensure that any foreseeable operation carried out on one service doesn't detrimentally affect the other. So this is where you say that perhaps the owner of the water service or the gas service might reroute pipe work. And then if you were to remove that bonding clamp from their service, we've got to make sure that it still provides continuity onto the second service. So yeah, it can be done, but we can't cut and join at the first service. We have to have that looped connection, so that even if the bonding clamp's taken off the first service, there'll still be continuity onto the second one. And as you pointed out also, great point, that you're now going, although you're using the one conductor, you're going to two services, so you will need two electrical safety notices on your bonding clamps to make it clear to the users of the installation that connection shouldn't be disconnected. Let's have a look what else we've got kicking around. Okay, yeah, very good one. That this was a light bulb moment when it was pointed out to me, I remember. So a question we often get asked: before undertaking an electrical installation condition report, would you recommend a site survey of the site if we've not worked there before? So
aside from BS 7671, definitely. But even in BS 7671, there is a regulation that refers to it, 651.1. It says, where there is no previous documentation, investigation of the electrical installation shall be undertaken prior to carrying out the periodic inspection and testing. And you know, what we're looking at doing is making sure that we're conversant with the installation before we go ahead and we're doing any inspections or testing. We need to understand the processes of which are being followed, the areas of the risk, and the hazards, and making sure that the installation in itself and the age of the condition can be taken into account as part of your condition report. We want to know as much about that property as we possibly can to make sure that the customer at the end of that gets an effective condition report to tell them where there are areas of improvement, areas of lack of safety or lack of safety measures that we're required to have for 7671, or where there is danger to live persons, livestock or property. So having an understanding of that property before you go and finalise your condition report is a very key aspect to make sure that you're giving them an effective report at the end of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's, you know, I was always sort of brought up that, you know, if you're walking in somewhere new and you're told as per normal that there isn't any installation certificate, there's no copies of previous condition reports, then your spider senses should start to tingle and you should really be on the lookout. But yeah, it was the time when it was actually pointed out to me, like you said, it actually says in the test and inspect part of 7671 that if that documentation is available, you shall do, you know, so it's a requirement, a regulatory requirement. If that previous documentation isn't available, you should do a site survey. And I think generally, you know, people would always recommend, so it would be a capital yes, because you want to find out so many things before you start. You know, are you going to have access to the areas that you want? Are you going to be able to isolate supplies? You know, can you see things being used how they're used in real life? So yeah, there's so much. And why is it being tested? You know, has something happened? Has there been an incident, an accident that's forced them to test, or is it just periodic? You know, so all of those questions you really need to answer and resolve yourself, so that you're happy, and then you know what you're going to go in and you're going to look for. You might perhaps agree if sampling you believe is relevant based on the size of the installation and the variation that you see. So yes, so much pre-preparation work can be done as a result of that site survey, which is then going to save you so much time on the actual during the days of the actual inspection and test. So yeah, very, very important.
It's also worth noting that survey that you do before is worthy of having a conversation with the customer about what the agreed limitations are in relation to that work. And doing that survey allows you to have a greater scope of understanding of what may be limited, or where your extent of inspection and condition reporting may stop, given an area within that property. So it's a very important thing to do is have an understanding of that installation before we conduct a condition report. And I believe the guidance notes talked about that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, thankfully we've got some questions have come into the chat from tonight, so we'll start to pick up some of those questions. The very first one is the NIC EIC state very clearly that verification of RCD is confirmed by a 1 times I delta N test at either 0 or 180 degrees. Guidance note 3 however states that at both 0 and 180 and record the highest. We have been made aware of this, and yeah, the engineer that's put the question in, absolutely right. We clearly stated in our 18.2 updates, the presentations that we did and the previous wires that we did, that you only need to do it at 0 or 180, and that's because of the conversations that we've had with the instrument manufacturers, and at the time that the Amendment 2 work was being done, with JPEL and all of the people that contribute to those committees and the regulation changes. And yeah, we were, you know, it was made clear during those conversations that there is no need to do both. There's no significant difference between the both, and so you can only do one. We recognise that there is conflicting information out there in guidance note 3, and we are working again with the people who we originally spoke with, to get that clarified. But yeah, we're standing by our original statement that you only need to do 0 or 180. There's no need to do both. And it's quite interesting, you know. We had a great wire presentation which you can watch back on demand, that was last Wednesday, and we talked about a lot of changes that have come in as a result of Amendment 2, and how many people would change the way that they test RCDs now based on that knowledge, and we had a very good response of how many people will change, and ultimately it should result in some time savings, because we're now saying that there's far more emphasis on selecting the right type of RCD for the application, and less requirement to do lots of tests which are actually included as part of the product test. So that's really the principle that's happened, and hopefully it will reduce time, which on large installations will be quite a significant saving. Would you add anything to that 0-180 conversation, Craig?
Yeah, I think it is worth noting that in Amendment 2 of 7671, I've got it in front of me here, that there's no mention that it has to be done at either both sides of the sine wave and the highest one taken. It just says, regardless of the RCD type, effectiveness is deemed to have verified where an RCD disconnects within the time stated below with an alternating current test at the rated residual operating current, and it says for general non-time delayed it's 300 milliseconds maximum, and for time delayed S-type sits between 130 and 500. So there's no reference in that particular regulation to have it recording the highest of either side of the sine wave.
Yeah. Okay.
The guidance is the guidance, but the regs are the regs.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. It's a very good point in that, you know, the regs are a minimum requirement, and there is lots of guidance out there which is over and above the minimum. So yeah, that's one thing to sort of always bear in mind. Another Amendment 2 based question. We've got, if I install an earth rod, is it right that I have to do a 4-metre ground survey to ensure that there isn't another rod on another property? How does this fit with Amendment 2 recommendation that earth rods are installed on TN systems? Okay, the change in Amendment 2 about a recommendation is noted that it's been there previously. It's just really been highlighted in Amendment 2 as a recommendation on TN systems. However, I think you've also got to think, well, why am I installing this extra rod? And if it's for a particular reason, say for example because you're putting a vehicle charging system in, and you want to try and not need to put a pen conductor in, so you're trying to meet the relevant ident of section 722, then you've got specific guidance of what value that earth rod's got to be. But if you're looking at it in terms of general, then you know we suggest you strongly consider the regulation above that recommendation, because it talks about if your earthing system is being provided by the DNO, then they've got a responsibility to maintain that earthing system, and you should certainly consult with them if, for example, you believe there's too big a potential between your installation's earth and true earth, because you know we should be putting some emphasis on them to reduce that difference, and perhaps them to look at the earthing system, whether it be TNS or TNCS, to ensure that we don't have to. We also think you've got to consider as well, if you're doing this to try and mitigate open pen situations, there could be a situation where you might be the only one that does it in the vicinity, and then the problem will be is that if there is a broken pen in your area, it will be your earth rod that acts as a source for that diverted neutral current. So although you're trying to do something to the benefit of your installation, it could have a detrimental effect. So our advice is If you're going to do it, consider it for the reason, whether it be because you've got a vehicle charging installation that you want to use it for, or whether you've got an alternative generator supply that you're going to use it. But if it's just the general requirement of meeting the recommendation on a TN system, then our advice is to strongly consider the regulation above this reg that refers you back to the DNO for any issues that you've got with earthing. Would you add anything to that? Are you getting some noise out in the field about the recommendation to add an earth electrode?
Yeah, there's a lot of talk about it, about, do we have to do it, don't we have to do it? It's like, well, it is only a recommendation, so it's not a regulatory requirement, it's not a shall, and therefore it's not something that we have to do. But, considerations, having a chat with the DNO, there might be other parts of the installation that you actually might look at having an earth electrode in if you decide to go island mode, if you've got battery storage systems and such like that. But that's a different requirement than just the recommendation. But I think the question is in relation is the overlapping earth electrode paths. I think, judging by listening to that question and a review of making sure that it's not expensive parts in those areas. Again, it's in the guidance, but it's not in 7671 to do those checks.
Okay. Another general one, if only changing light fittings, is there a need to add RCD protection if the circuit has no RCD? So I think we'd have to look at that in two ways. Are we making an alteration or addition, or is this a like for like change? So what would be the things there and the difference that's involved, Craig?
So if it's a like-for-like change, it's an accessory change, and there's no requirement in 7671 to ensure that circuit is RC protected on that lighting circuit for an accessory change or an equipment change. However, if it is an alteration or an addition to that particular circuit, Chapter 13 talks about the need to make sure that any additional alteration made to the installation is to the standards that we require it to, and RC protection being for domestic lighting circuits. So an example, which is a common one that we see, is if you've got a singular light in a bathroom and they've had some renovation work and they decide to change that to 4 spotlights and extractor fan and outside zones. Now that's an alteration to that particular circuit now, and therefore that would require RCD protection. Yeah. On a domestic situation at least.
Yeah, spot on. So if we're talking about domestic, where it's now a requirement to protect the circuit supplying luminaires with an RCD, then 7671 in its scope says it includes alterations and additions. So now if we're making an alteration or addition, then we would need to comply with the new reg. Strictly speaking, only our alteration and addition would need to comply, so you might not need to RCD protect the whole circuit. In some instances it might be easier to do it that way, but in other instances, perhaps because you don't want to inherit something that's there already, you could just provide RCD protection for your additional alteration, so for example through an RCD spur. But if it is just, as Craig said, like for like change, then that's not treated as an alteration or addition, and it wouldn't come under 7671. You might still consider to talk to the customer about the enhanced protection that an RCD provides, but it wouldn't be a requirement to fit it on a like for like change. Okay, I think a follow up to the question that we talked about on a 3036, so where the absence of RCD goes hand in hand with an old 3036 board, why make it sound so positive that they can be used? So yeah, we were really talking about can they still be used, and yeah, you've got to make sure that it provides adequate protection. So if something needs the enhanced protection of an RCD, so for example you've got sockets supplying mobile equipment outdoors, then although the 3036 fuse could be used for overcurrent protection, it clearly can't provide the additional protection requirements. So then you would need to consider an alteration to add that additional protection.
It's also to do with condition reporting, is it? We see it in the field where someone says it's 303.6 fuse, and therefore I'm going to give it a C2. But the reason that we generally find does ask for a conversation is that the circuit doesn't have RC protection. Well, there's a difference between whether or not the circuit has RC protection and whether or not it's just because there's a 303.6 fuse there. So I think, yes, you made them sound positive, but that's because we can use them. There's nothing precluding us to use them. If we require RC protection or additional protection by other means, then we have to provide that as well. As long as that's there. As an example, if you had an upfront RCD, 30 milliamp RCD, ignoring the division of installation and 303.6 fuses and everything all being equal was fine. There's nothing wrong with them.
Yeah. Okay, we've got another question coming. If you install a new DB for electric vehicle charging and it's got 2P RCBOs, I'm reading phonetically. So I think you're saying it's got double pole RCBOs, so we meet that double pole requirement for EV. Do I need a surge protective device? So I think this might be one where we'll look at both instances. So if we look at right now amendment 7671, including amendment 1, surge protection requirements would only be for the current 4 idents. So we're not talking about loss of supply resulting in loss of injury, human life, interruption of public services, commercial or industrial activities, large number of co-located individuals. So then it would be down to, if we're talking about a vehicle charging in a single dwelling, then it would be a discussion with the owner about just how much damage could be created, and they might consider it a requirement based on the potential cost of the car, but you've also got to weigh that up with the likelihood of an overvoltage occurring in that location. So that would be the requirement in current Blue Book. There's been a change in Brown Book, so now if we go to Brown Book,
so it says for serious injury or loss of human life, then it is required. Failure of a safety service, as defined in Part 2, and significant financial or data loss. Those are the 3 indents that require surge protection. And then it moves on to say, for all other cases, protection against transient overvoltages shall be provided unless the owner of the installation declares it is not required due to any loss or damage being tolerable. So the key aspect there is that it must be the owner of the installation, and they must declare that the damage, if a surge does occur, is tolerable, and they accept the risk of that consequence of the loss of that part of the installation. So if a surge does damage the possible open device equipment, or it damages the vehicle, it will be down to the owner of that installation to deem that tolerable or not.
Yeah, absolutely. So and we would advise getting that, documenting that situation, because it's a key criteria on what you're choosing and selection as part of your design process, and just so that information can't be lost and forgotten about, we would certainly recommend documenting that, you've got their agreement that they deem any potential financial loss tolerable. So that's if we're going by Amendment 2. And another SPD one. So is a Type 1 and 2 SPD adequate for safety services in a dwelling for an overhead supply, or would it be recommended Type 1, 2 and 3?
Sounds like design advice, that does say.
Well, the type would really be dependent upon what you're actually protecting, and obviously the big differences between types 1, 2 and 3 is that 3 will actually cope with less of a surge but let through less also. So type 1s would normally get at the origin, where obviously the voltage disturbance is likely to be its greatest, but you might then need type 2s, for example, at distribution boards within the installation, and then if you had particular items of equipment which will be vulnerable to a much less voltage, then you might want type 3s at those. So it's really that hierarchical approach. Look at the equipment that you're trying to protect, and for the reason that you're trying to protect it, and look at the impulse voltage that equipment will withstand. Get my words out right. And then that will determine whether 2 would be adequate based on the amount of attenuation voltage that will let through. But if you've got some very sensitive equipment which you have to protect, you might also need type 3s. So it really does boil down to what you're protecting. Would you add anything on that, Craig?
Not particularly. No, that's pretty well explained there, Sam. It's to do with making sure, a bit like selectivity of overcurrent devices. Similar vein is the hierarchical approach to protecting our delicate equipment or vulnerable equipment that could be damaged through a surge, which we see much more of these days. We've gone other days where we have inductive and capacitive loads that are not likely to be damaged. Incandescent lamp, for example, that has a surge. What does it do? Not much. Gets a bit brighter, gets a bit dimmer, doesn't really care, but you put that through a delicate LED or a control gear, and then that could have a severe detrimental effect to the operation of that piece of equipment.
Absolutely, yeah. We'll take another couple. So new consumer unit, cables rear entry, would you fit fire stop entry for the cables? And we get this quite a lot, definitely on distribution boards and consumer units, but also on other accessories. And really it boils down to, well, what am I coming through? Am I coming through a fire barrier that I've actually opened out to get my cable entry? Because if we talk about the enclosure of the consumer unit itself, then that's deemed by the manufacturers to be compliant with the requirement to ensure that it's got a non-combustible enclosure, and that shouldn't be affected by if you use their prescribed cut-out entry methods. So we don't need to fit it to ensure that the enclosure still complies with that requirement. But what we would need to do is, if it's of a certain size, which is specified in the regs, once you go above a certain size, if we break a fire barrier, so let's say we're coming through a wall or partition that's there to create a fire barrier between two fire compartments, then we would need to seal it to make sure that we haven't detrimentally affected our fire stopping. So that's the real question. What are you putting a hole in? It doesn't matter about the enclosure so long as we use the manufacturer's recommended entry routes. We won't be affecting the enclosure's capabilities, but we might be affecting the barrier that we're physically putting that consumer unit or distribution board on. Any more you'd add to that, Craig?
Yeah, I think you very clearly explained that. It's to do with the fire compartmentalisation of buildings, and not so much the non-combustible element of the consumer unit. The rationale behind plastic consumer units converting to metallic consumer units was to do with the detrimental effect of molten plastic falling onto more combustible material in a location. So that's why we've got metal consumer units. The sealing of the back is to do with, as Sam was saying, the compartmentalisation. If I've broken through a fire barrier that needs to be reinserted, then I've got to reinsert that fire barrier. It's to no lesser extent than it was before I made those alterations. So yeah, there's two sets of regulations that we're looking at there, and I think we're getting a bit confused as to which, if it's to do with non-combustible consumer units or it's to do with fire stopping between compartments.
Yeah. Okay, and just very quickly, someone said, does that mean that Type 1 SPDs will always be used at the origin? Generally, yes. Your Type 1 is there to cope with the largest magnitude of transient overvoltage, and typically you'll get Type 1s at the origin. You might get Type 2 if it depends upon what you're trying to protect, but if you are going to use a Type 1, it will be at the origin. If you've got more vulnerable equipment, different location, for example, you might not have a type 1 at all and just have a type 2, but in generally you will have a type 1 if you're going to have one at the origin. Okay, we're dreadfully running out of time as per always, so we'll just pick up our last preview question. So do we now need to provide RCD protection for outdoor lighting?
So you're actually in my wheelhouse here, Sam. Part of my career before an assessor was I worked in street lighting and infrastructure, so outdoor lighting comes a bit of a second nature to me. Now, there have been some changes between the requirements that 767 had with Amendment 1 in relation to Amendment 2. So that there's been some wording that have changed and different aspects that have now been included as requiring the additional protection by an RCD between the First Amendment and the Second Amendment. Okay, so the 2020, so that the not so recent amendment here, lighting in places such as telephone kiosks, bus shelters, advertising panels, town plans are provided with additional protection by an RCD, having the characteristics specified in 415.1.1. So the changing that we see here in Amendment 2 is that it says lighting accessible to the public shall have additional protection by an RCD. Now, this doesn't include, okay, there are some examples: garden spaces open to the public, telephone kiosks, bus shelters, advertising panels, but the list is not exhaustive. But there are some exclusions to that for people that might work in street lighting or the allied highway industries. Is that street lighting and traffic signs and illumination of monuments and platform lighting at rail and bus stations are not included within that requirement to have RCD protection. So the inclusion that is between Amendment 1 and Amendment 2 is places open or lighting that is accessible and open to the public. Now, this was unfortunately a change from a death that we witnessed in the industry, where it was a fatal accident of a young child in the pub garden. So that's why these have been included into Amendment 2 here.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, very, very sad reason, but you know, unfortunately a good example of why sometimes we have to make changes, and that change there is to enhance the protection provided and hopefully make things a little bit safer for future installations. Okay, we've run out of time again. I just want to pick up on a few things. So just make you aware of some webinars that we've got coming up in the very near future. Later this week on Wednesday at 8 o'clock, we're trying something different. We're trying a technical quiz. There's a natural voice in my head that says I want to say it's a technical pub quiz. It's not, unfortunately, a pub quiz. We're going to be not in a pub, but yeah, we're going to try out a technical quiz. We've got some questions wide and varied, ranging from all over the regs, just to give people a bit of light entertainment, a bit of fun, but also hopefully it will be informative, because we'll explain the answers and say how we got them. So if you're interested in that, just a little bit different, we're going to see if the format works, if we can actually run a quiz over the webinar software. So that will be interesting. That's this Wednesday, and then roughly every fortnight there'll be a Wednesday wire. So on the 1st of June we've got another one on LV generators, which is something we often get asked about and is seen as a little bit of a side specialist subject. On the 15th of June we're looking at the changes to certification and reporting as a result of Amendment 2, and then on the 29th of June we're re-looking at electric vehicle charging, again on the basis that the changes in Amendment 2, and we're also looking at some of the changes that are coming up with the new Part S, which is associated with electric vehicle installations. So if you can sign up for all of those wire webinars already if you haven't done, so please shoot along to the nic.com events page, and also just want to say about the next Monday night Q&A session is actually next week. We're running two consecutively because we got a little bit out of step In general, we try and run a Monday night when there isn't a Wednesday night wire, so they'll run every other week. So we just got a little bit out of step when we've been doing all of the Amendment 2 wires. So there's another Monday night session next Monday. That's Monday the 23rd of May, same time again, 8 o'clock. Thank you very much everyone that put questions in the chat. Some great questions. Apologies if we didn't get round to your question tonight, but we will scoop all those ones up that we didn't get a chance to answer tonight, and hopefully cover those off at the start of next week. So so yeah, thanks if you did put a question in. Apologies if we didn't get round to answering yours, and we hope you've found it useful tonight.
Don't forget to include this in your CPD, your unstructured CPD log for the EAS requirement. So it's another 40 minutes you bagged by watching us today.
Excellent. Okay, well, without further ado, from myself and Craig, thank you very much, and hopefully we'll see you again perhaps on Wednesday, or if not, next Monday.
Thanks, Sam.
Cheers,
Thanks,
Craig.
all.
Bye bye.